a white individual whose name I will not mention killed 8 individuals, and 6 of the 8 individuals were Asian and they were women. He specifically targeted Asian women at these businesses, but law enforcement and the media refused to, charge this as a hate crime. We find out the killer's name first, the killer's story first. Oh, he's just a troubled man who's very religious.
My friend asked me how my week was, and I honestly couldn't remember the entire week. I was just in such an odd place because of that shooting. And I don't know, it was lonely because life was just moving on. Like, this wasn't that big a deal for a lot of them. And for me, it was such a big deal. When I saw the faces of the people who died in the shooting and their families, it really hurt because they looked like people in my own family. They looked like people I grew up with, my classmates, my neighbors. It really just emphasized how much we weren't seen as human in this country, how foreign we were to most people. Our lives really didn't matter to them in that moment because a white man had a bad day.
On today's episode of Let's Talk Politics.
I think it's really important to call oppressors on their crap. I think a great sign of unity is stepping up and saying, you just said is bigoted, and I will not have it. We will not have that here.
The main reason why it's pervasive is because it's so widely tolerated.
In response to the Atlanta shootings that occurred on March 16th, I sat down with Reverend Chaz Howard, Professor Josephine Park, Penn freshman Gemma Hong, and College of New Jersey junior Gabriella Sun. My name is Daniel Gurevitch, and this is Let's Talk Politics. It started on 5 p.m. on March 16th at Young's Asian Massage in Ackworth, a suburb northwest of Atlanta. 4 people were murdered, and a 5th, a Hispanic man, was injured. 47 minutes later, the Atlanta police responded to a robbery at Gold Spa in northeastern Atlanta. They found the dead gunshot-riddled bodies of 3 women. Officers at the scene then received reports of shots fired at the aromatherapy spa across the street. Once they arrived, they found another body of another dead woman. All told, 8 individuals were murdered, 6 of them Asian American women. Their names: Soon C. Park, Hyun J. Grant, Soon Chia Kim, Young A. Yu, Xiao Jie Tan, Dao Yo Feng, Delaney Ashley Yun, and Paul Andre Michaels. Note that Elcias R. Hernandez Ortiz survived, but according to last reports, remains in intensive care. The murderer, a 21-year-old white man from Woodstock, Georgia, has been charged with 8 counts of murder and 1 count of aggravated assault. Police are still investigating the motives of the murderer, but many individuals are calling it a gruesome hate crime against Asian Americans. We need context to really understand the Atlanta spa shootings. Why were Asian American women targeted? What's America's hidden history with anti-Asian American sentiment? You're about to hear from Josephine Park, an English professor and member of the Faculty Steering Committee of the Asian American Studies program here at Penn, to help answer these questions.
The history of anti-Asian sentiment in America goes back to when Asians first arrived. It's been constant, it's been widely tolerated, and it's incredibly pervasive. I think the main reason why it's pervasive is because it's so widely tolerated. Something that's actually been hard for other people sometimes recognize because it's so widely tolerated. But of course, those of us who are subjects of it feel it.
Professor Park talked a lot about how the history of anti-Asian American sentiment is filled with pervasive tolerance for hatred. I was curious what she meant by this. When I asked her, Professor Park explained how Asian Americans have historically been excluded from America and have been looked at in a sexually intimate manner.
The Chinese were the first group to be barred from entry to the U.S. Even when Asians were permitted into the U.S., they were ineligible for naturalization. There was a lot of legislative work to manage and to prevent Asian families from establishing.
Professor Park also explained how the Atlanta shootings were a product of the historical sexual intimacy with Asian Americans.
Some of what we saw, obviously, in the Atlanta shootings is very clearly a product of a certain kind of intimacy with Asia, highly sexualized and eroticized.
When I asked Gemma and Gabriella to explain the history of anti-Asian American sentiment, like Professor Park, they talked about how Asian Americans feel ostracized in America.
It all stems with perpetual foreigner syndrome. The fact that Asian Americans are not Americans, they're foreigners. They're, people who brought the China virus. Like I had a man when I was walking in Manhattan, he screamed coronavirus at me, even though I was born and raised in this country. I've never even been to Asia, right? But that doesn't matter to him. I don't look American, whatever that means, so I'm not American. Even though we've been in this country since the 1850s, we're always, so otherized and we're not seen as Americans. It's not because, we don't want to, it's because our country doesn't treat us American.
We truly don't know about Asian American history. The pre-existing anti-Asian sentiment of comparing Asians to viruses as being virus carriers has exploded into violence before. You see it in the Honolulu Board of Health burning down 41 buildings in the city's Chinatown during a bubonic plague flare-up in 1900, and a man setting fire to the Santa Ana Chinatown 6 years later while firefighters and local residents gathered to just watch. The firefighters weren't there to actually take out the fires, they were just there to see if the fires would spread to the white neighborhoods. This violence isn't unprecedented. This is a systemic issue that has been going on for a really long time, that this is just a new chapter in a really long volume of anti-Asian sentiment in the US.
A theme that arose from the previous answers was COVID-19's impact on anti-Asian American sentiment. At the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the FBI warned that it expected a surge of hate crimes against those of Asian descent. A new report from the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, based on police data for major U.S. cities, found that hate crimes against Asians rose by almost 150% in 2020, even though hate crimes as a whole fell by 7%. In response to this, Penn established the Task Force on Support to Asian and Asian American Students and Scholars in April of last year to, as they state, coordinate and enhance support to members of the Penn community experiencing increased stigma, bias, discrimination, and violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. Here's what Reverend Chaz Howard, the Vice President for Equity and Community of Penn's Provost Office, had to say about the task force.
A lot of the call to form that group really formed out of the early anti-Asian sentiment, specifically anti-Chinese, but broadly anti-Asian sentiment, after some of the bigoted statements coming from elected leaders, connecting the suffering from COVID-19 and coronavirus to people of East Asian descent, and the kind of very clumsy, very dangerous speak from people, predictably and tragically led to a series of violent attacks that we're still feeling and seeing are all around the country right now. There's a measurable uptick in violence against Asian bodies. Physical violence, verbal violence, and other forms.
Having the explanation of the history of anti-Asian American sentiment allows for a better understanding of what happened in Atlanta. This wasn't just a singular mass shooting. It was a continuation of deep-rooted hatred against Asian Americans, specifically Asian American women. It was the buildup from a year of individuals labeling the coronavirus as the China virus or Kung flu, and a 139-year buildup from the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a law passed by the U.S. Congress in 1882 to curb the influx of Asian American immigrants. Given the history of Asian hatred, I asked Professor Park if she was surprised that the Atlanta shootings happened.
I was surprised. I was shocked and horrified. I've heard of people say, this was bound to happen, and I'm not surprised. The formula for what happened all so obvious in our culture, in our kind of political climate, all of them very obvious. We can identify. It's not hard to identify the causes and the circumstances for all of that to happen. But when it all comes together, it is horrible and shocking. So I was deeply shocked. I was deeply surprised. I knew things were terrible. I knew something terrible would happen, but it was a surprise.
As Professor Park said, the shootings still were painful, regardless of if they were surprising or not. Reverend Howard had something similar to say.
Sort of seeing Asian women shot in Atlanta, an older Asian woman in New York sort of sucker punched, or the sporadic attacks that have happened all around the country. It just hurts to see, and it's scary, for my friends of East and Southeast Asian and South Asian descent to sort of feel afraid. That hurts, and it pisses me off. I am concerned for the safety of my friends, and that is the first level, is the very human co-suffering that I think many of us are feeling right now.
As we continue to examine past just the historical issues surrounding Asian Americans, it is important to also examine present-day problems with the media's reporting on Asian Americans, something that was especially clear on the Atlanta shootings. Many critiqued mainstream media for describing what happened as the Atlanta spa shootings instead of as an Asian American hate crime massacre. Similarly, many in the media described the shooter's motivation with what he himself called, quote, a sexual temptation that he wanted to eliminate, instead of as a hate crime. When I asked Gemma about this, she explained the juxtaposition between how Asian and American outlets reported on the shootings.
Boson Daily, Korean reporting daily newspaper, interviewed witnesses who were there who couldn't speak English. That was how we figured out the fact that the shooter had screamed, kill all Asians, and other anti-Asian sentiments while he was committing this atrocity. A simple language barrier was what stopped American media outlets from even asking about what happened. They just immediately went to the police. But the police chief who was reporting on this event that said that the shooter had a bad day was actually had posted anti-Asian things on his own Facebook before. We just have to check who we're getting information from, the biases of these people that we're getting information from, because if we're publicizing the viewpoints of these people instead of the people who are actually affected by the event, we're definitely going to get a distorted view of what actually happened there, a very biased view.
In addition to the failures of the media to accurately report on the Atlanta shootings, I also asked Reverend Howard about how many horrific events, such as the Atlanta shootings, have escaped the public consciousness. He attributed this problem to the 24/7 news cycle.
It bleeds, it leads, but only for a minute. It was a tragedy last week, and then a big barge got in the canal over there, and that was it. And now Biden's got a whole new infrastructure plan, and that's the thing. And the guy from Florida's got some weird scandal, thing after thing after thing. Mark of contemporary media consumption and media production. And I don't mean to besmirch journalists. I think they've been beat up enough over the last 4 years. It's just the way that news is shared and dispersed and consumed.
So what do we do now? We know what happened on March 16th, and we know the history of Asian American sentiment. But what's next? How can we improve? Three themes arose when I asked Reverend Howard, Professor Park, Gemma, and Gabriella about what college students, specifically those at Penn, can do to stop events like this from happening in the future. Those themes were education, unity, and speaking up. Here they all are talking about how we must educate ourselves.
Just educating yourselves is really important. We're an educational institution, and that's what we have to offer. The field I'm in, Asian American Studies, is actually kind of a product of a radical activist moment in the late 1960s and 70s. And so the field really came out of an academic location. And now is the time to renew our commitment to academic fields of study into racism, into anti-racism. And I think every Penn student can become extremely knowledgeable about the history of racism, the causes for it, the climate for it, the cultural political conditions for it, its prevalence, the kinds of policies that can be instituted to both prevent it and, so all of those things is what we're kind of uniquely capable of doing. Penn is one of the few Ivies to have an Asian American Studies program. It has an amazing Africana Studies program. I mean, I think our students are especially well equipped, actually, to kind of grow and learn out of this crisis.
At our core, we are an educational institution, and Penn does a lot of things, but primary charges of Penn is that we educate. And so I think that's sort of the first answer I would say is people need to learn. And there's so many Americans who don't know about the camps that Japanese Americans were sort of forced to, or terror and lynchings essentially of Chinese Americans in years past, or laws banning Chinese immigration and like other systemic and very cruel forms of discrimination and violence that happened for decades in our country. So we need to teach people that history. I mean, there's been such an important, beautiful push for a broader education of Black history. We have to do the same with other populations too, or the old cliche of we're doomed to repeat it if we don't know our history.
So you're never going to learn about our culture just by drinking bubble tea or watching anime. You actually, that's a surface level appreciation. I don't even know if you would call that appreciation, but you actually have to talk and interact with us. Number one, if you have a friend like me, I'll never stop talking about the ways in which my people are oppressed, right? And number two, if you're my friend, if you're with me, you'll get to see firsthand the kind of racism, discrimination individuals like myself have to deal with. They're AAPI students like me on my campus at UPenn. And those 4 years might be the only chance you get to either learn about who we are by taking, for example, an Asian studies, or actually interact with us, because when you go back home, there won't be any people who look like me. So yeah, when you're at college, don't just go making friends because it's in your comfort zone, right? Go interact with, all these diverse people, whether diverse races, diverse socioeconomic situations, diverse genders, sexualities, right? Go meet these people, right? Because you might never get this chance again.
Most of the people I interviewed also talked about the need to be unified.
Don't tokenize us, but don't talk to us just because we're your coworker, just because we happen to be your classmate, right? Actually get to know who we are. And when you talk to us, don't ask how we learned English, because still asking those kind of questions, you have some work you need to do. That's telling me that you don't have many interactions with, AAPI individuals like myself. And you're basing what you think these people to be off stereotypes.
Conversations around racism and equity and justice cannot simply be black-white conversations. It's understandable that much of the conversation is around racism against people of African descent. And yet we can do that to a fault where other groups that experience hate and marginalization and discrimination and violence can be left out of the conversation. And so the painful reminder that we have to keep this conversation broad with the same fervency and the same passion and commitment for Asian sisters and brothers And beyond that, for Latinx folks, people of Middle Eastern or Arab or Native American heritage, we have to be wide-sighted in it's for protection, but for sort of communal growth and economic justice and every aspect of it. This must be a very wide conversation. Over the last couple of years, painful violence against Jewish Americans, be it the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting or the kind of cruel Jewish cemeteries in the area here, and seeing Muslim and Christian and Hindu and Buddhist and people who are not of faith traditions stand out our love statue, all holding candles, all grieving Jewish students. And then after a violent attack at the mosque in New Zealand, Christchurch, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, non-religious, grieving with them, holding candles and standing lock in lock with them there too. Penn often will stand with people in pain. We have to do the same right now with our Asian students, faculty, staff, and alumni. This is what we do best. We stand together amidst our differences, and hopefully we can model that.
After unification and after education, most of the people I interviewed talked about the need to speak up to defend the underheard and the underprotected.
Amplify our voices. Don't speak over us. Lift our voices up. Help give platform to our messages. Don't stay silent in the face of injustice, even if it makes people uncomfortable. Even when we're not there, when they make comments that dehumanize us, when they make, those passing jokes. It's those kinds of jokes that build up this culture, that uphold this culture of violence towards us, of normalizing hatred towards us. We're not the butt of your joke. Our lives aren't something to be joked about, because every single one of those moments of casual racism build up to things like these, where people think it's okay to scream coronavirus at us, treat us like a virus, treat us like sex dolls, treat us like lives that are meant to be discarded on a bad day. You have to check people when they say things like that, because it ends up in things like this.
I think it's really important to call oppressors on their crap. It's easier to sit on the sideline of the game, but I think a great sign of unity is stepping up and saying, you just said is bigoted, and I will not have it. We will not have that here. We'll write op-eds about it. I will write articles about this. I will protest. I will outside of your White House. I will stand outside of City Hall and raise my fists and say, we were not having that here. That is not what we will tolerate. Those of us who aren't feeling the sting, Asian hate and discrimination, we need to speak up and say something. I think that's real solidarity right there. And then using our influence and our kind of role to fight for change. And so hopefully that people will hear this and keep this on the agenda of things we need to work on and things we need to stop.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Let's Talk Politics about the Atlanta shootings. We implore you all to not only educate yourself from this podcast, but to go forward and speak out to defend and help others, as Reverend Howard discussed. A huge thank you to Chaz Howard, Josephine Park, Gemma, and Gabriella for sitting down with me and providing their extremely valuable voices for this podcast episode. Please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment on this podcast episode. We'd love to hear from you on your thoughts. This has been a creation and presentation of the Penn Political Review. Executive produced, written and directed, and edited by me, Daniel Gurevitch.